Okay, why don't we get started? Um, so let's just review, and I believe Netter, what we'll do is once we're finished with a whole bunch of requirements for the mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda, we'll review in a much easier format in the sefer that I showed you, Hashavat Aveda Kahalacha, the mitzvah of returning lost items according to halacha. What we basically saw is that there are two types of lost items: those lost items that have a siman and those lost items that don't have a siman. That's what we were learning about in our previous halacha on Friday, is that some items that you find can have identifying signs and some don't. For example, scattered coins or scattered cash do not have identifying signs. But if they're collected in a container or even like a rubber band, then that is considered to be a siman. That's considered a sign, the number of coins or the denomination of the coins. And what we pointed out is that it depends if there was yesh or not. If you can assume that the person who dropped it already has discovered his loss, if you know that, if it seems reasonable to make that assumption, and something does not have a siman, so then there's no mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda, and you can keep the item for yourself. If the item has a siman, then in most situations, unless, for example, it's like buried treasure, so then you have to assume that the owner has not had yeush, because maybe there's hope that they may retrieve it because it has some identification or identifying signs. And therefore you have a mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda. Many times there's a mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda even when an item doesn't have a siman, because when you pick it up, the owner is not yet aware of it. And as we said, if the owner's not yet aware of it, then when you pick it up, you're picking it up on their behalf. Okay, so we're continuing in Halacha Test today. V'chein kol shehu davar chashuv k'ma'os, ve'adam ragil mashmesh bo kol sha'a. Anything like money, which has value, and a person usually discovers their loss immediately. V'chein kol davar kaved shenos al kseifo b'socheko, shemin hastam hu margish samach l'nefilas or shehekel mimasao, harehem shalo. And any other kind of item that a person normally carries on his back or on his shoulder or in a bag, and he would immediately discover the loss were it to fall from him, so then you can assume that an object like that you find, the person has already had yeush. Let's say you find a bag of apples. Well, it depends. If you find a bag of apples that a person was driving in their car, so then that's not something that they would necessarily know. A lot of people, for example, sometimes while they're unloading their car from the grocery, may accidentally leave a sack of potatoes on top of their car, forget about it, and then drive off without realizing that they forgot to bring the sack of potatoes that was on the back or the hood of the top of the car. They drive off, and they're totally unaware that the sack of potatoes fell in the middle of the street as they were driving off. So that's not a situation where you can say, oh, a person would be aware of it right away. Because if you transport the item in a vehicle, so then you're not aware of it. It's only if it's something that you normally transport by hand, and then it falls, the person will discover it immediately, then you can assume that the item, that the person has had yeush, and therefore you're allowed to keep it for yourself. A, it doesn't have a siman, and B, the owner has already had yeush. Im nikar hadavar shalohun chusham b'derech hanacha ela b'derech nefila. If it's clear from the circumstances that the item was dropped and not deliberately placed in a certain place, sha'az ein siman b'makomam v'lo b'minyanan. Because if it fell, then there's no siman, because a person may not know where it fell. He just now realizes that it fell, and so he's had yeush, and there's no way for him to claim the item. But if it was deliberately put down, so then sometimes you can give a siman by saying, oh, I left it in a certain place. The place itself becomes the siman, the place where the guy left it. And sometimes the number of items, let's say I put down on the ground some, 24 eggs, planning to retrieve them, and then I forgot and I drove off. Well, clearly a dozen eggs were deliberately put down, because if you drop a dozen eggs, then there's a good chance that almost all of them will be broken. So you have to be able to eyeball the situation and to see, was this deliberately put down? Was it, and then the person forgot about it and walked away or drove away? In that situation, you have a mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda, because the person can identify, they can remember where they put it down. Uchagon she'ein siman begufan, but in a situation where there's no siman in the item itself, and there's no siman in because they fell off a car, or they fell out of a bag or something like that. So there's no siman in their place. There's no siman necessarily in their number, because who knows, maybe they fell out, slowly, and there's no way to know how many originally the person had. And there's no siman in the item itself. V'gam ein ra'ui litain siman b'kishreihem she'im kishurim bahem kigon shekishurim kederech shekol ha'olam koshim osam. And also, you have to make sure that there's no other simanim. Let's say the bag was tied in a funny way. If the bag was tied in a funny way, so then the tie itself is a siman. So don't be so quick to assume that an item doesn't have a siman just because it's a nondescript item like coins or apples or things like that. Ve'ein sham shum shinoi, ve'gam ein roi litain siman b'midasam v'lo b'mishkalam mipnei she'ein darkam b'kach klal. And furthermore, you're able to also ascertain that there's no siman in their weight or measure. Sometimes if a person can identify, it was a 5-pound bag of potatoes, or a 10-pound bag of potatoes, or a 20-pound bag of potatoes, that would be a siman. Okay, but we're talking about a commodity that is not sold by weight or number or something like that. So we're restricting further and further all of those circumstances where if you find something, you'd be allowed to keep it. Generally speaking, if you find something in Thornhill, if it's not just scattered coins or currency, then there usually would be a siman on the item. V'gam ha'oved enu yoda, u'lechach b'syayish behem. And the person who lost the item is not aware that of any particular siman that he can identify on the item, and therefore he has yeyush. Only under those circumstances can you keep the item. Umikol makom. And then further, we'll go even further. After everything has been said about the very rare circumstances where an item does truly not have a siman, imhu davar sheyesh bo tvias ayin leba'olav kagon kelim sheba'olav yecholim lahakira b'tvias ayin. Let's say you find a lost object. It has no siman. It's a nondescript fork. It's a nondescript spoon. Doesn't have any kind of markings on it that could identify who is the owner. But there are times where if you trust the person who says that he lost the spoon, and you ask him to look at it and say, "Is this your spoon?" and he says yes, then you should still give it back to him. Afal pi she'ein bo siman, mipnei sheyesh harbe kelim domin lo b'tzuraso, hareze chayev lahachriz im mitzo b'makom shetalmidei chachamim mitzuyim. He says, if you find an item where there are a lot of scholarly people, and what we mean by scholarly is that they are very meticulous in halachic observance, and you find the spoon, even though the spoon is something that is nondescript, and maybe a lot of people have that very same spoon, but nonetheless, many times a scholarly person will be able to look at it and say it's theirs, and you should believe them because they are meticulous in the way that they speak. And what would be an example of where you find a spoon in a place where there are scholarly people? Kigon beveis hamedrash, ki stam talmid chacham eno mishanem midiburo. And the reason why you should give it back to, like if you find something in the base medrash and it doesn't have a simon, the reason why you should return it to its owner and make an announcement, put something on the bulletin board and say that you found it, even though one could exempt themselves because it's an item that doesn't have a simon, is because you can trust scholarly people who are meticulous in their observance, that they're not going to claim something falsely for themselves. Ki im bidvarim shemuter l'shanos, because a Talmud Chacham doesn't lie except for very rare situations where it is permitted for a Talmud Chacham to lie. When is it ever permitted for a Talmud Chacham to lie? Can anyone think of situations like that, where it's permitted for a very knowledgeable, very meticulous person to lie?
Were your fear of insulting or embarrassing someone?
Yeah, fear of insulting or embarrassing, trying to make shalom, and not
On
to,
bias specifically, I think.
to diminish machlokes. The Gemara specifically states that there are 3 instances where a Talmud Chacham is allowed to lie, even if it's not for shalom. And if you take a look at the Imrei Yaakov, he says as follows: Shemuter l'shanos, hainu b'masechta, b'puria, o b'ushpiza. The 3 cases that the Gemara gives where a Talmud Chacham is allowed to lie are in his learning, in his bed, and in his host. Now, what do those 3 things mean? Learning, bed, and host. Ketzad. So here's an example. Haya osek b'maseches nida, va'omar b'mikvaos ani shoneh kidei shelo yishalu oso she'ilos b'inyan nida. So the first example is, if a person is studying a particular maseches, but he's not confident that he's mastered the material yet and doesn't wish to embarrass himself. And so we know that there's normally a halacha that if a scholar is learning X studies, you shouldn't ask him a question about why, because he may not know the answer because he's not holding in that subject material. Okay? So he wants to avoid being asked a question in the laws of Nida, because even though he's studying it right now, he's just started studying it and he's not up on all of the halachas. So if someone says, "What are you learning?" and he anticipates that they want to ask him a question about the laws of Nida, he's allowed to say, "Oh, I'm learning something else right now," even though he's really learning Nida. Right? A guy comes to him and says, "I have a shaila in the laws of Nida. What are you learning now? Can I ask you the question?" He's allowed to say, "I'm sorry, I'm not holding there. I'm learning something else right now." And that and even though he is learning the laws of Nida, he's allowed to deny it if he's concerned that he may not be able to answer the question, or he wishes to avoid answering the question. Kidei shelo yishalu oto sheilot b'inyan nida. So that's the first case of masechta, where he's allowed to say he's learning something else. Second case, puria, bed. Sheyashen b'mitazu va'omar bezu ani yashen, shema yimatzei sham keri. A person wishes to avoid embarrassment, and someone asks him, "Where are you sleeping?" And he says, "I'm sleeping in that bed," when he really slept in the other bed. He may be embarrassed because there may be a stain in the bed from some sexual activity, and he's embarrassed to point to the bed sheet. So he's allowed to lie about that to avoid an embarrassing or compromising situation. Okay? Third case, and these of course are examples. We're not going to hold you to these specific situations, but the Gemara is giving you illustrations where a person is allowed to save himself embarrassment or through divulging personal information which would make him embarrassed, right? O shenitareach etzel Shimon, va'omar etzel Ruvain ani mitareach. Or let's say he's a guest at Shimon's house. Okay, let's say a Talmud Chacham is visiting from out of town, and he's staying at Shimon's house. And when he gets back to his own town, someone says, "Oh, who did you stay by? Who hosted you when you went?" And he's allowed to say the name of another person. He can say Ruvain instead of Shimon. Now, why is he allowed to do that? Kedei shelo yatriach al zeh shenitareach etzlo. And the answer is, and you can probably relate to this, is that let's say you hosted someone who's visiting from Israel, and you don't want him to go back to all of his friends and say, "I stayed by Yankel," because then all his friends who are going to want to visit Toronto or from Israel are going to want to stay with you, because they'll figure that you're a very benevolent and welcoming host. And you're going to end up with a line of people wanting to come and stay with you. So sometimes and this was the Chiddush of the Gemara, sometimes even praising someone is considered to be sinful, and you should actually lie about praising, about how nice another person is, because the famous joke about the barber, right? So the priest comes to get a haircut, and the barber gives him a haircut, and he says, "What do I owe you?" And he says, "No, you're a man of the cloth. I'm not going to charge you." So the priest is so appreciative that the next day he leaves a box of rosary beads, of 10 sets of rosary beads at the entrance to the guy's door. And then the next day a minister comes to get a haircut. And after the haircut he says, "What do I owe you?" And the barber says, "No, you're a man of the cloth. I'm not going to charge you." And the minister is so grateful that he leaves a stack of 10 Bibles at the entrance to the barber's door. And the next day the rabbi goes to get a haircut, and the rabbi says, "What do I owe you?" He says, "No, you're a man of the cloth. I don't charge." And the rabbi is so appreciative that the next day there's a line of 10 other rabbis at the barber's door. All right, so that's the that's the old joke, and it's not a very nice joke because it doesn't reflect well on us. But the fact is that there's truth to the joke, is that because you're not supposed to praise that you got a favor from someone if that could cause that person to be exploited by other people who know that you're a softie and you're going to want to do them a favor. So I never tell people who does me favors. Something like, someone wants to help me with something, I'm very, very grateful, but I never let people know that this person does me a favor, because I don't want other people to take advantage of that person. That's generally speaking, people who are nice get taken advantage of. And so that's why that's the third thing, is that you're not supposed to, if you're fearful that by telling your friends when you get back that you stayed by so-and-so, that there's going to be a long line of people wanting to stay by so-and-so, you have to lie. You're not supposed to tell them. Kedei shelo yatriach al zeh shenitareach etzla. So those are the three cases to avoid personal embarrassment, or to avoid causing inconvenience to someone. Those are situations where you're allowed to lie. And like I said, it's not specifically these three cases. Let's say a person, it's not just specifically which bed did you sleep in. It could be, you accidentally stuffed up the toilet, and someone wants to know who stuffed up the toilet. If it's going to cause you embarrassment, then you don't have to fess up, in certain situations, right? So that it's all under that genre, right? And then there's a fourth scenario where you're allowed to lie, and sometimes it's a mitzvah to lie, when you're bringing peace between people. O shehevi shalom bein adam lechavera, v'hosif v'gara kedei lechavav an zeh lazeh, where you're bringing peace between two people, and you are exaggerative in order to make them come closer together. Harei zeh mutar. That's permissible. Now, the example that's brought in the Medrash is that Aharon HaKohen was a big liar. Aharon, I hate to say it, our Zaidi was a big liar, but he only lied in order to bring peace between people. What did he do? If he saw two people got into a big fight and they're not talking to each other, Reuven and Shimon got into a big fight, he would go to Reuven and say, Shimon feels terrible. He just feels absolutely terrible. He can't sleep. He can't eat. He wishes that the two of you would make shalom, but he's just too embarrassed to apologize. And he would tell Shimon the exact same thing about Reuven. When in reality, Reuven and Shimon are still angry at each other, and they're not interested in making up. But once the other one would hear that the other one feels terrible and is embarrassed and so forth, so they would meet each other in the street and they would hug each other and they would make up, right? So you're allowed to do that. However, ulam afilu mipnei hashalom lo yavtiach sheker lechavera. He says there are poskim, however, who limit the amount of falsehood that you're allowed to, that a Talmud Chacham is allowed to engage in. You're only allowed to lie about about a false narrative of the past. But you're not allowed to promise a person something in the future. Like, I promise you that if you make up with that person, that I'm going to give you X, Y, and Z, when it's never going to happen. Or that you're going to get this and this and this and this. Right? You can't, that you're not allowed to do. Right? V'lo amr demutu l'shanas mipnei hashalom ela besipur devarim shekavar avru. That v'lo bedavar shalahaba. So this is from the Magen Avram. He says that you're not allowed to say a falsehood about the future. You're only allowed to relate a falsehood about the past and be exaggerative or enter into drama about the past. Right? That's not true. V'yesh cholkim u'matirim b'chol gavni. But there's those who are even lenient on the future. And they say that a Talmud Chacham is even allowed to lie about what's going to happen. And I promise that if you make up with him, all these good things are going to happen to you, and it'll be wonderful for you, and don't worry, you'll see, and da-da-da-da-da. Some poskim say that you're allowed to do that if the ultimate objective is to create shalom between two people, whether it's a husband and a wife. Don't worry, your wife told me, you'll see that if the two of you get back together, she'll completely change and she'll be a totally different person. When in reality, you know that likelihood is not very great. But sometimes, in order to make shalom, you have to smooth over even things about the future, according to some poskim. Questions, comments. So therefore, if you find an object in a place where the majority of passers-by in that place are scholarly people who are Talmidei Chachamim, who only lie in very, very limited circumstances where it's halachically permitted, but would never lie. You'd never suspect them to lie to say that thing is mine when they never lost such an item. Or to say, oh, I recognize it's mine when in reality it's not theirs. So therefore, uchashiyakirenu hatalmid chacham b'tvius ayin v'yomer shalihu bevadai lo yedaber chazav. So therefore, if he says it's mine, he's not lying. He's not going to want to lie. So then v'yitanenu la. Then in that kind of situation, even if an item doesn't have a simon, you should still make an announcement that you found the spoon in the Beis Medrash, or you found some widget in the Beis Medrash, and you should post a sign. And whichever Talmid Chacham wishes to come forward and claim it can claim it. But then he says, "V'yesh lehistapek bizman hazeh im yesh leTalmid Chacham chazak hazu." It's not clear to me, says the Rav Shulchan Aruch, if we have such great scholars in my day. He's writing in the 18th century. He's not sure. Aval, okay, so that's where we're talking about a kli, a utensil. Aval hamotze mos mefuzaros beveis hamedrash, harehem shalosh she'in b'matbei tfiyas ayin. But if you find coins scattered on the floor in the Beis Medrash, those you're surely allowed to keep, because no one can say, I recognize that those are my coins, unless there's certain denominations that you can identify. Ve'ein tzarich lomer imatzu beveis hakneses, and that's certainly true if you find it in a synagogue, because a synagogue is filled with both meticulous people and non-meticulous people. A beis medrash, we assume that everyone who's in there is very meticulous, but a synagogue, a shul, not so much. And therefore, if you find something in a shul and it doesn't have a siman at all, and there's no way for people to say, I recognize that as being mine, by all means go ahead and keep it. Ve'ein tzarich litein litzdaka kamo shekasav b'Orach Chaim siman kuf nun daled. And you should not feel obligated that just because you found it in a shul, you should give it to tzedakah. There's no such halacha that just because you found it in a shul, you have to give the money to tzedakah. Okay, this is a cursory overview of this halacha. We'll do a little bit more Imrei Yaakov and Mirz Hashem tomorrow. Questions, comments before we conclude? Okay, if not, wish you a wonderful day. We'll see you Mirz Hashem tomorrow. Take care.